Well, howdy there, folks, and welcome back to another episode of What is Texas? The only game show where you, the viewer, compete to show how much you know about the Lone Star State. Let's get started with tonight's first question. Question 1. What is the most powerful law enforcement agency in the state of Texas? Is it A, the legendary Texas Rangers, historically capable of more than their fair share of violence? Is it B, the Dallas Police Department, infamously bad at prisoner transfer? Or could it be C, the Highway Patrol, the state troopers of the Texas Department of Public Safety? I do love the livery on those cars. Very minimal. So minimal, they did not include the of. Go ahead and put your guess down in the comments below. And while you're there, don't forget to like and subscribe to What is Texas, and we'll be right back with the correct answer after this.
Yes, here's the car that's built exclusively for Texans.
Or do you say that's what this man was doing?
Take this cute.
Texas fishermen and the warden don't think it's cute at all.
I don't fish, that's what's funny.
And it's named for the Lone Star State.
Well, hey friends, welcome back to What is Texas? Before the break, we asked you, what is the most powerful law enforcement agency in the state of Texas? Is it A, the Texas Rangers, B, the Dallas Police Department, C, the state troopers of the Highway Patrol? That's right, the correct answer is secret answer D, the Game Wardens of the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department.
I've preached individual accountability. I have turned myself in to the game warden.
Okay, so why do I say they're super cops? Well, basically they can, do whatever they want, right? Like they can, search your property without a warrant or necessarily suspicion of a crime. And they can enforce all kinds of laws, not just laws related to fish and game, of course. They can enforce any law. They can enforce the penal code and the traffic code. The United States Supreme Court has even codified this. It's something called the open field principle. In a case called Hester v. U.S., they determined that unless you're within the area of your domicile, they can come right in. There's something called curtilage. Lawyers sound off in the comments. But it's like the area immediately around your house, like where you live and carry out your private business of living. But if you have land and you're out on it and someone can see you doing something on it, well, like a game warden in this case could go onto your land and, give you a hard time, see if you got a, hunting permit, ask you questions. Here's the thing, game wardens, they just are not like other cops. They're built different, like literally in the statute. Parks and Wildlife Code, Title II, Chapter 11, Subchapter A, Section 11.019 states, law enforcement officers commissioned by the director have the powers, privileges, and immunities as peace officers coextensive with the boundaries of the state. That means all 256 counties, 258, all the counties, and pretty much everywhere. No, not pretty much everywhere, coextensive with the boundaries of the state. The authority as a sheriff to arrest, serve criminal or civil process, and require aid in serving criminal or civil process, coextensive with the boundaries of this state. A law enforcement officer commissioned by the director may arrest without a warrant any person in this state found in the act of violating any law. Any law. It was not always the case. This changed in the 1980s. The statute got updated. And correct me if I'm wrong, but previous to this, game wardens, they enforced fish and game regulations, hunting regulations, stuff like that. But they didn't always have this ability to make traffic stops, for example, or, enforce the penal code. It's kind of weird that we don't hear more about this. Like, they're highly empowered. They can give you a hard time anywhere, anytime, for just about any reason. Again, they're just not like regular cops. And public opinion about policing, I don't know, it's all over the place. I don't know. I could look at studies and tell you things, and I've looked at some. Recent polls in Texas show a vaguely positive view of policing, but that gets skewed once you start to break down and demographics and things. And of course, there aren't a lot of opinion polling about game wardens in particular, none that I could find really. And also, I think polling is kind of weird. I mean, obviously there's this thing called push polling where they'll ask you questions just to sort of plant an idea in your head in the first place, or just sort of drumming up a conversation. But also more generally, I think the problem with polling is like, it tends to do this thing that people do in politics where they turn something into a hypothetical. They think about it in a vacuum, like, you know, they're at the Athenian Academy and they're talking about Platonic ideals or solids or something Plato would talk about, you know? But that's not really what we're talking about when we're talking about laws and stuff like that. We're talking about actions that people take that have like material consequences on the world. And that's especially true when it comes to things like the environment and when it comes to things like wildlife.
This was her annual dove hunt, but it looked more like a hunt for votes. She did get off a few shots, but most were aimed at GOP challenger George W. Bush.
It's the first time I ever shot this gun.
Bush was up before dawn for a dove hunt in Hockley. Here's where something went wrong. Bush was warned of an approaching dove and took aim. What he shot was not a dove, however, but a protected killdeer. Bush apologized for the mistaken kill and promised to pay a fine. He also attacked the new penal code.
There is one kind of cop that America overwhelmingly loves, and that is the conservation officer, of which a game warden is one type, right? Game wardens specifically enforce hunting and fishing regulations. More on that again later. But there are other kinds of conservation officers. The most obvious to Americans, I think, being the park ranger of a national park or, you know, a forest ranger. They're mostly concerned with enforcing regulations about the use of those wilderness spaces, right? And being like an interpretive guide for visitors. As a whole, park rangers and the National Park Service staff has the highest approval ratings of any federal agency by far. I think by far, but they definitely have the highest approval ratings. And I suspect if you polled people about game wardens, I mean, besides I don't know as being probably the biggest category, people might rank them as like mildly annoying sometimes, you know, like they give you a little hard time when you're out fishing or whatever. So in a story called Off the Pavement in the December 2020 issue of Texas Parks and Wildlife magazine, Stephanie Salinas Garcia profiled and talked about the history of the game wardens. The first wardens were commissioned in the late 1800s, 1895. And this is right before Texas' economy is going to switch from cotton and cattle, mostly. We still have plenty of both, but it's going to switch over to oil. My power just went out. Okay, let's continue. Anyway, 1895 was also the year that Texas created the Fish and Oyster Commission. The first concern in Texas in terms of environmental impact of hunting and fishing was overfishing along the Gulf. By 1919, there were 6 wardens. A decade later, there were about 80. And of course, throughout the 20th century, there's a lot of growth of how we manage wildlife and the scientific approaches to wildlife, and setting up like standards and models for how we manage wildlife, not only across counties in a state or across states in our nation, but also, you know, across continents, because, you know, animals don't care what county they're in, you know what I mean? Although the game wardens might. I mean, it'll determine which sheriff they call, I don't know. But in the 70s, they got peace officer status, which meant they were fully cops. And in the 80s, they became super cops, able to enforce the traffic code, the penal code, and of course, all the parks and wildlife regulations, which is basically everything, and it's everywhere in the state, and no, they don't need a warrant, according to the Supreme Court. So what are we left to think about this? I mean, we don't hear about them very often, and I think most of the time that's because the kinds of interactions a game warden is having, they're low stakes, they're small scale, they're mostly with people who are armed. You know, I think it just kind of makes sense that there aren't a lot of big deal. You know, with game wardens, it seems like there's a really high potential for corruption, but I think the opportunity is really low. And again, game wardens are not like other cops. They are in competition with other law enforcement agencies, including park rangers, for desperately needed cadets. Basically, any law enforcement agency will tell you they are short of cadets. And being a game warden is pretty hard, and it doesn't pay very well. Again, high potential for abuse of power and corruption, but again, low opportunity. Game wardens also have to have a bachelor's degree before they can apply to become a warden. So they usually have some kind of background in a field that's going to give them like a sense of expertise in what they're doing, right? They're not just enforcing laws, but they're someone who is usually informed on a topic. It could be law enforcement or criminology or something like that, sociology, I don't know. But of course it could also be science. It could be environmental science. They could go be an Aggie and learn a bunch of that Aggie stuff that would probably prove pretty useful as a game warden. Anyway, that's just kind of how I see it. And if I were in a different law enforcement agency, I'd be thinking about that. You never hear about game wardens, and that's probably a good thing.
Call it coincidence, but on the same day, game wardens were hauling the remains of a 9-foot alligator. Texas can make America.
When you went face down, you stayed face down.
Okay, so why am I talking about game wardens, and why am I doing it now? It's the middle of summer. Bow season doesn't start until September, and whitetail firearm season doesn't even, that's not going to happen until November, I think. Well, because the game wardens made headlines for a huge operation that busted a statewide deer smuggling ring. That's right, folks, we're talking about ghost deer. No, it's not that glowing thing from the wizard, it's not like, Bambi's mom? Sorry, too soon. Ghost deer are like undocumented deer. They're like deer without papers. If you want to breed deer and transport them around in Texas, it's pretty hard to do. And the main reason is because according to the state of Texas, native wildlife like the white-tailed deer is the property of the state of Texas. Wildlife is a part of the environment which belongs in common to the people of Texas and is regulated by the government of Texas. And you don't have to ask me, you can ask the Texas Supreme Court. You can ask the Texas legislature. They've held firm to this many times. Because at the end of the day, a native animal species is a part of the environment. If it changes in some way, like say a big disease outbreak spreads, well, that's a public health problem. So if you're gonna manage something that belongs to the people of Texas, well, yeah, there's gonna be a lot of regulations about that. See, if you're a deer breeder in Texas, you don't own the deer. You're like managing them as livestock briefly until you release them, at which point they can never return to a pen. They are wildlife after that. Spooky, can you hear the thunder?
This is the dumbest thing I've ever heard of.
Drive silver or get pulled over.
You have to tag all of your deer with an RFID chip. You have to do testing for chronic wasting disease. We can talk about that later, but it was a disease first observed in the wild in the 1960s. Much later, it was observed in Texas in both wild and captive populations. And it's known as zombie deer syndrome, which is pretty much what it sounds like. I don't want to show you pictures or video of it because it's like kind of upsetting. Like it's disturbing, like you lose control. You're like a zombie, basically. It's related to mad cow disease, which we know is transmissible to people. And it's similar to other prion diseases, the human equivalent being Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which is pretty bad and is always fatal. And so you have to test the lymph nodes of the deer you have in captivity. And it's pretty gruesome. You have to do like an autopsy. You have to take out the lymph node and like part of like spinal tissue, and then you send it off to Texas A&M, and then they do tests and they see if they have chronic wasting disease. Well, this is really timely and expensive and unpleasant, and at the end of the day, it's hard to make money trading in a public resource, I guess. There's a lot of regulations, and breeders try to get around them. Now, if you want to learn a little bit about all those regulations and what it takes to breed deer in Texas, there's a story from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram from a few years back that gets into the nitty-gritty of what makes it so difficult, so link in the description. Anyway, why would they be breeding deer? Well, because you can breed them to have like really crazy racks of antlers, right? Like trophy deer, like, you know those people who breed like pit bulls, and they make this like Instagram posts that look like a postcard flyer you'd get for a college party or like a party at a nightclub. Yeah, they're like that, but it's not a pit bull. It's like a Franken deer, like a complete freakazoid, like a whitetail buck, but you took moose antlers and you just kind of glommed them on. It's a strange thing, and I guess it's so you can guarantee that you could have a hunt where you get like a trophy buck, but you know, that's generally considered against the fair chase principle, you know what I mean? That's getting close to like a canned hunt, right? Shooting fish in a barrel, if you will. And also, like, if you're gonna like basically genetically engineer super antler deer, like, you know, and I guess it's not genetic engineering, it's breeding, but what is breeding but genetic engineering over generations instead of like in the lab? I don't get it. To me, it's kind of like, you know, throwing deer corn out in your yard and then shooting the first deer that walks up and then going out and gluing really cool antlers onto it so people will be impressed. But like, come on, man, that's a lot of trouble. Now you're going to a lot of trouble now. And speaking of a lot of trouble, 24 people were caught in this statewide game warden operation, tracking down these ghost deer. In fact, one of the things the accused are accused of is cutting out the lymph nodes of dead wild deer and sending those in as if they were from the living deer. Also, like switching out tags and stuff, and then, you know, you sedate them and then you move them across county lines so you can drop them off somewhere so someone can hunt them, you know? Again, is it hunting if you're putting the thing there? Like, isn't that the opposite? Isn't the definition of hunting finding something, you know? Like, people breed cattle and they put them in pens. So, you know, they keep them on ranches, even if they go on for acres and acres, you know, they keep them penned and then they eat them because they're for food. And we could do that with deer, I guess, but that's a different thing than hunting. That's not my point. But one of the people involved, one of the prominent people in custody now with the game wardens, was a former director of the Texas Deer Association, which is sort of the industry lobbying group for deer breeding in Texas. Here's a short summary. A South Texas deer breeder and his business partner were caught attempting to smuggle 7 deer from a licensed deer breeding facility in East Texas through Montgomery County to Brazoria and Duval counties, where they intended to illegally release the deer into the wild on private property. To me, this is theft. This is theft of a public resource. It's like if you secretly tunneled and like got an aqueduct from like a river, and then you had it, you know, you drink the town's milkshake. You know, you just take the water and you siphon it off to your property. I mean, it's public property. It is wildlife. They take it, they turn it into a genetic mutant super Franken deer, and then they go and put it in a private land for somebody to just, you know, sort of like happen upon and shoot. You know, I mean, it's just, I don't get it. If somebody can explain it to me, I'm not a hunter, but I think part of the reason I'm not a hunter is because to take a life, you should have a reason, even if it's just a deer. And like, cool deer, rack of deer, cool antlers make me look cool, no. That's selfish. You're stealing public goods and a deer's life for to look cool. Like, just go buy a cool piece of art, man. It'd be so much easier. Anyway, the interesting thing about this is it was initiated by a traffic stop. This is not something game wardens would have been able to do before the change in the statute in the 80s. And what they uncovered was huge. One of the only times game wardens get in the news. So that's the background. What does it look like in the future? Well, I think it's going to be pretty contentious. I mean, even this legislative session, there was legislation introduced to do away with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department altogether. Basically deregulate wildlife and parks. It was defeated, but it was introduced by Representative Curry of Waco, who is a deer breeder. Anyway, the whole deer breeding thing is really fascinating to me. I came into this just thinking like, oh, here's a fun fact about game wardens, you know, like they've got a lot more power compared to other cops. And this bust was interesting because the conflict between the state and deer breeders is interesting just because they're so intertwined, and also like it's a fascinating deep question about politics, right? Maybe this is an area where we can see the hypothetical politics and the material politics sort of getting mixed up, because like do these deer have rights, and what rights do we have to do things to the deer, but also, regardless of whether we have the rights to do things, when things happen, how are they going to affect the ecosystem and ultimately us? So anyway, that's it for today. I'm going to change the ecosystem in here because there's a gnat flying around my forehead. If you want part 2 on the deer breeders, like, subscribe, comment, ring the bell. Ghost deer, black market bucks. Ghost deer, black market bucks. Big bucks on the black market. Getting racking. It's a rack attack. I've had enough of this.